Here we head into what should constitute the game's second act. However, since we are proceeding under the assertion that the game has no story, my even calling this a second act is generous. The game continues to plot itself out in an and then this happens and then that happens mode of progression from here on out, without any semblance of structure. So here I'm just going to cover a small section of the game's events as they occur chronologically. And where we left off from last time is Kratos and Atreus' journey to the mountaintop where Kratos intends on scattering Faye's ashes. Generally speaking, I have laid out why the game has no story, and so all that's left to cover really are the finer details. Beyond structure, there are other aspects built into a story that would make a story what it is, and so there I reckon is the benefit to talking about what the game is trying to be. So much of the dialogue in this game has been praised, but if anything ought to be praised about it, it's the delivery of the lines rather than the lines themselves. The voice acting is superb. The dialogue itself, however, is bulky and redundant. For all intents and purposes, it amounts to nothing more than talking about the weather. Now what do I mean by that? Well, there's a reason people in everyday life find it appropriate to talk about the weather. The topic is innocuous. It's a safe way to mediate the air between two parties and create a conversation. But the reality is not much thought or effort is projected into a conversation about the weather. I mean, if you look outside on a cloudy day and say it looks like it might rain, well then the other party won't have much to contribute outside simply agreeing, disagreeing, or saying nothing at all. And that is how most, if not all, the dialogue in Nu-GoW is written.
I'm happy we met Brock, but I'm happier we're leaving this place.
It is behind us now.
Now we'll get to the mountain quick. I just can't believe I'm here, doing all this. There was a time I thought I'd never leave our woods, or even my own beds.
You were not to blame for your sickness.
Oh, I know. I guess I'm just saying. This is great. Is he friendly?
Boy.
I promise you, he's safe.
There's the mountain. Look how close we are.
We flow into seawater.
How do you know?
Do you not smell it?
If that smells the sea stinks. How long do you think this has been here?
A very long time.
Whoa. Sure is foggy here.
All of these instances are of characters making milquetoast observations, punctuating what's literally going on before our eyes. It's narration on top of a visual medium. In other words, what we are seeing, the characters are retelling us through dialogue. But where this gets tricky is when you consider the fact that all your thoughts and feelings are being ferried through this very fine filter. The audience is no longer thinking for themselves, because the medium intends to take complete control of all their faculties, all to point us in a very specific direction and lead our brains toward very specific conclusions. Needless to say, this is all very bad writing, for a good writer would write enough to allow his audience imaginations to run wild. What Nu-GoW does, however, is confine its audience in a manner not unlike Plato's cave. When you compound this with the writing's didactism, what you're left with is a world where the audience is not allowed any leeway into thinking about any of what's going on from their own thoughts and feelings, from their own perspective. All is being very specifically guided to very pointed conclusions. Now this is all very postmodern. The world being built here is inherently contradictory, but one could only see that if one has the capacity to see things as they are. Because of that, the writers are having to provide all these layers of context so that you, the audience or the player, is unable to interpret or reinterpret things according to the way that one sees them. Instead, the game's writers are continually having to tell you and retell you how you're supposed to align your thinking with the ongoing events. Freedom of thought and action are antithetical. In retrospect, some of the characters in the future will make fun of Kratos for grunting or not having much to say. But the sad reality is, not much of what any of the characters say really needs responding to, since most of the answers are obvious. Case in point here is Atreus basically recounting the events for us, the audience, by asking his father a few pointed questions.
You've had to kill people before, haven't you? You're used to it.
We do what we must to survive.
Animals, I get. They're food. Draugr, they're supposed to be dead. But people, they're trying to survive too.
But all this does is pad out the game's runtime. It's redundant. Further pointedness gets across by Atreus specifically commenting on Kratos' penchant for killing things. And the reason this is unnecessary and redundant is because the pair of them only just went on a hunt to kill a deer and a troll. That was the lesson that Kratos had intended to teach his son, or at the very least, it's what one assumes was the lesson. And as a bookend to this conversation, Kratos tells his son the following.
Close your heart to it. On our journey, we will be attacked by all manner of creature. Close your heart to their desperation. Close your heart to their suffering. Do not allow yourself to feel for them. They will not feel for you.
And this too will be rendered redundant very shortly. So the pair of them continue to climb until they reach an area overlooking the entire landscape below. And then we get some more pointed dialogue with Atreus specifically saying,
Look. All this time, there's been a protection stave around our entire woods. But the stave's broken there. Did you cut those down?
She hand marked the tree she wished used for her pyre.
When I say pointed dialogue, it's dialogue that has been tailored specifically for the audience to understand what's going on screen. Note that pointed dialogue is not always bad, and sometimes it is necessary depending on how a story is paced. Nevertheless, this is dialogue written to acknowledge what the author wants the audience to know, regardless as to how that is worked into the story organically. As far as Nu-GoW is concerned, it's another oddity. Atreus specifically remarks on something that could have been turned into the very reason that he and his dad would have departed in the first place. And something else to consider here is the fact that Kratos now knows his wife was responsible for having him cut down the very trees necessary in forming the protection stave, which thereby threw Kratos and his son directly into the line of danger. Naturally, this confuses Atreus.
Why'd she do that?
Come. No looking back now.
What, so you're just going to ignore the question? But see, the dialogue here is also tailored specifically to perpetuate a mystery box. All despite the fact that Atreus makes a really good point here. Why would Faye have purposely thrown her husband and son in the line of danger without even the courtesy of warning them beforehand? Imagine if dad and boy fell asleep without knowing the barrier was gone and they were attacked by Draugr in the night. I guess it's only luck that they were attacked by Baldur when they were, and then they arbitrarily decided to go on this mission. Note that the second game, God of War Ragnarok, seems to have an answer for all of this, but even there, the reasoning makes Kratos out to be an utter doofus, while Faye is just made out to be manipulative and deceitful.
You prepare for a distant future. There is much time ahead of us.
I wish to better a future that will exist without me, whenever that day comes. For you, and for our son.
Regardless, dad and boy journey on, continuing to fight through the occasional Draugr, until they reach a stone with runes carved into it. And then for seemingly no reason at all, the game has Kratos promptly ask Atreus to come look at the stone.
Boy.
Sir! There's a Jötnar settlement ahead.
Jötnar.
Giants.
You can read the writing.
Some. Just the language his mother knew.
Now this is another instance where the dialogue doesn't follow its own sequence of events. Why would Kratos have even called Atreus to the stone if he didn't know Atreus could read it? And one can't say the game didn't intend this because it actually gives you the prompt.
Just the language his mother knew. But they're all sort of connected, so sometimes I can feel my way through stuff I shouldn't know. You know?
But that's not how language works. What Atreus should have said here is that for anything he couldn't understand, maybe he could at least educate a guess based on the context. But what's really disappointing about Atreus' explanation here is that what the player is essentially being told is Atreus will just translate everything and anything unless the game's plot dictates otherwise. For a game riding on the wonders of the Old Norse myths, the developers don't make any effort to give that to the player in any way that is meaningful. Hell, even calling this stuff surface level would be far too generous, considering how much of this world differentiates itself from the mythology it sought to extrapolate from. Imagine instead a world full of puzzles that require the player to learn about what runes mean, and how the Old Norse language is actually meant to be read. A game that would actually instill within the player a desire to learn something about the mythology about which it is supposed to be based. And so by the end of the game, Kratos, and by extension the player himself, will have begun to learn a new language. And And if you're thinking that would have been boring, then maybe you're not actually playing this game because you care about Norse mythology. Now, as Dad and Boy continue onward, Kratos will lift a large stone pillar with his bare hands, and he moves it aside like it's nothing. And Atreus has no reaction to that. Now, of course, this won't be the first time Kratos does something supernatural in front of his son, but it's something to remember with regard to the fact that Atreus doesn't know at this point in time that his father is a god. And considering that, how does Kratos justify any of his godlike feats that he freely displays in front of his son? Now think of all the massive geographic changes that occurred due to the fight with Baldur. And while we may assume that Atreus just never witnessed the fight, what else would he conclude? I mean, Kratos didn't even answer his son when he asked how any of that destruction could have happened.
Whoa. How did this happen?
But that's all part and parcel to the mystery box buildup. Dialogue is tailored specifically so that relevant questions are either not asked or are just left unanswered. Moreover, this is why one doesn't understand why the dialogue in this game was ever praised in the first place, because none of this makes any sense from a narrative point of view. One may also suspect the writing was procedurally generated, and that's why it doesn't make any sense. I'll often refer to the writers when I talk about a medium, but at the same time I do wonder how much of the writing was actually done for this game and how much was left to an AI. Whether or not the dialogue and the action on screen match up may be an indicator that human diligence didn't pick on these lapses in the narrative. And I've already mentioned two instances of this. The first was Kratos saying they would do what they please regardless of Faye telling them not to, followed up by his telling Atreus that it was always Faye's wish for them to proceed. So which one is it, Kratos? And the second, of course, was Atreus insisting that he lost control because the troll was trying to kill them, even though Kratos had already felled the creature anyway. And now we have a third instance. The game prompts Kratos to ask Atreus to come look at runes on a rock, and when Atreus does read them, Kratos reacts in surprise that Atreus can read them.
Boy,
Sir! There's a Jötnar settlement ahead.
Jötnar,
Giants.
you can read the writing.
So, as father and son continue, Atreus attempts to cross a bridge leading to their destination. And while at first he feels it's safe to cross, one of the planks breaks beneath him. Now, the game means to have Kratos run out to the bridge and save his son, but that's just idiotic. It would never have been the correct course of action. But unfortunately, the player isn't given any alternative here. One supposes the developers presume your brain is turned off. But the bridge is obviously unstable and Kratos knows it. And so the last thing he would have done here would be just to stride out onto it, endangering his son even more. And at the very least, if he did go out on the bridge, wouldn't he have held on to the supporting ropes, just in case more planks broke? Which would have been far more likely given he weighs far more than Atreus does. But the overall point I want to make here is that the game doesn't account for how smart the player is and instead sets everything down on a linear path. There's no hindsight into the fact that this makes Kratos look irrational and not at all wise and intelligent as a Spartan should be. And moreover, the whole bridge collapsing was apparently not even a big deal anyway, because Kratos is rendered immune to fall damage. So this just calls the former dramatic tension into question. Are we supposed to be worried about whether or not these characters will die to things like this? Now here you might be saying, well, of course Kratos would have run out of the bridge because he reacted. He was worried about his son, he wasn't thinking. No, you see, that's what I mean when the player really has no freedom here. It's not Kratos taking action. It's the player taking action through him. Therefore, it's the player that's reacting. Or maybe the player doesn't, because not everyone playing this game will react. Some will try to think things through. But again, that's what I mean when I say that kind of freedom is antithetical, because the game only does allot you one singular path of progression. Now later on, Kratos and Atreus will have a run-in with a group of cannibals. Before this happens, we have a return to earlier sentiments, with Atreus declaring that he'll kill anyone who tries to rob them.
Father, will we see others on the road?
Yes.
Friendly?
No.
They'll try and rob us?
Possibly. Yes.
Oh. Earlier, you said people might try and rob us. I'll kill them if they try. I'm not afraid.
If we encounter men, you will stay out of it. Understand?
But
You will stay out of it, boy. Speak no more of this.
So, not only are we being given a redundant conversation, but why is Kratos now contradicting his previous statements about Atreus closing his heart to suffering?
Close your heart to their desperation. Close your heart to their suffering.
When the pair of them do encounter the cannibals, Kratos then states that the fight is his alone, and so Atreus is forced to stay back. Within the ensuing fight, Kratos kills the majority of his enemies, but one of the cannibals grabs a hold of Atreus. In retaliation, Atreus stabs the man with his mother's knife and kills him. The entire experience traumatizes Atreus and leaves him in shock. He's never had to kill another human being before. And so in response, Kratos consoles him but repeats what he said earlier about closing his heart to suffering.
Close your heart to it.
This is again what I mean when I say that earlier conversations are rendered redundant. This scene is a learning moment for Atreus, in which case the previous dialogue about his supposedly encountering and fighting people, in addition to his father telling him to close his heart, were both unnecessary. But the game only added them as a means of padding things out. This is what the game does. It pads out its runtime by redistributing previous information. Now you might say this is foreshadowing, except that foreshadowing has poetic implications. In other words, something that happens early on in a story heralds what will occur later on. And the problem with this instance is we don't really get anything out of Atreus talking about he or his father killing people, other than that Atreus is apparently just working through it mentally. But removing those earlier instances of walking, talking dialogue doesn't change much, because visually the actual scene of Atreus killing the man and going through the trauma covers everything we need to know. Everything else was just padding out the running time. Another problem with this is that while these men most certainly meant harm to Dad and Boy, the ambush itself is made arbitrarily, furthermore calling into question the kind of lesson that Atreus learns here. What I mean is Atreus only kills this man who assaults him by accident, and that robs Atreus of what should otherwise be a growing moment. Now we know that Dad and Boy had set out and Kratos told him that they'd meet all kinds of danger along the way. But how would Kratos have even known that? True, the man may be a Spartan and a former god of war, but he and Atreus are not at war with anyone right now. For all intents and purposes, Kratos is a warrior, but he's not a soldier, and neither is his son. Point being, the game may have benefited far better if there were some kind of ongoing war and the characters were just caught in the middle of it. And that would give reason to Kratos' warnings and would have Atreus learning how to properly become a warrior that his father wanted him to be. Someone who could survive the rigors of war, but would also judge rightly who ought to live and die. In which case, if Atreus were attacked, he might kill a man simply because he was afraid for his own life. Here instead, one supposes Dad and Boy were lucky enough to have been happened upon by these cannibals at this pivotal moment, so that Atreus might learn a lesson about killing people. And now that that's over with, he can just move on. Another thing to note here is Atreus specifically used his mother's knife to kill this man. Now, something I had determined beforehand was the knife was symbolic, rather than being used as an instrument of deception and cruelty. In this case, Atreus instead used it in self-defense, and so the deconstruction of the knife continues. Now, Atreus isn't given too long to dwell on the fact that he just murdered someone, before his father simply urges him to push through the trauma.
You are in your head, boy. Let it go. He would have killed you.
I know, I had to do it. I do know that,
And funnily, Kratos suggests they go home if Atreus cannot find his resolve.
And we will go home, boy.
What?
To give up this easily. So close to the start.
He says that, but this comes after he and Atreus had already observed their lands would be overrun thanks to the loss of the protection stave. So a minor instance, but again the dialogue is not following along with the actual series of events as they've played out so far.
Listen to me. To be effective in combat, a warrior must not feel for his enemy.
And this is the third time now that Kratos has decided to give his son this particular talk. He does word things a bit differently, but the spirit of what he says matches exactly with what he said before. Again, the game's writers are padding out the runtime. They are giving you information that has already been conveyed multiple times so far. And why this is all necessary to keep in mind is, again, this game has been praised over and over again for its supposed good writing and storytelling. But once you start to break everything down, most of what the game amounts to is repeatedly giving you the same information and dialogue over and over, some of which is inconsistent with the actual events as they occur on screen. Now, I'll be covering the meeting with Brock in the next video. To bring things to an appropriate close here, I should mention there's one final avenue of criticism I'll be leveling at this game. Earlier I had talked about the characters reading runes and how the game developers have the player engage in a very shallow, not even rudimentary understanding of ancient Scandinavian literature and Norse myth. Now the problems with Nu-GoW stretch far beyond Nu-GoW itself. They also exist in other media that engages Norse myth as nothing more than a backdrop that contains Vikings, trolls, Valkyries, frost giants, etc. For as much as people who play this game may delight in the idea of Norse myth, how does that necessarily become meritorious if the game doesn't otherwise try to stay true to those roots? Some may seek to justify glaring deviations from the Poetic Edda and other Scandinavian literature by merit of its all being fictional. But there don't the deviations made undermine the basis for why the fiction holds value in the first place? For many it would have been enough to have placed Kratos within this particular backdrop, but the writers went the extra mile in completely revamping everything and everyone to the extent that the only resemblances the characters have are their names. To the point, Norse myth is and should be more than some fictional backdrop for whatever story one intends to create. Norse myth also formulates a basis for lives and livelihoods. We as human beings often seek out tales of heroism, of good deeds, stories that will instill us with the knowledge of good and evil. Norse myth provides all of that and more. While for some, Norse myth may be just a myth, to others it's a way of life, as real as reading history books or religious texts. But in Nu-GoW, the developers deal with the setting in a manner that is trite and self-serving. They're applying their own petty ideals to stories that have existed long before anyone living today was ever born. And if you were a writer dabbling in a world much bigger than you and yours, would you so readily hold the moat of your knowledge and experience against the tide? For if the stories of your fathers and forefathers outlasted them, then they'll surely outlast you. For all my viewers, if you want to help invest in my content, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty Cheese Knife. I also have a Patreon and I use Cash App, both of which function like online tip jars. For my viewers out there, I want to thank you all for watching and I recommend you stay tuned for more content down the road. Until next time,
Be adequate. What the hell does that mean, anyway? I don't know. Sounds like something the Forts would say.